Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this conference cycle of the Thomistic Institute. We have today a very special guest, dear friend of the chapter, Father Philip-Neri, the Dominican order. He is the
Acting director.
acting director of the Thomistic Institute in Rome. And we're very excited to celebrate this talk because we've been preparing it for over 2 years now, I think. And you know, the content of our talk is quite special because it's not just the the usual Thomistic approval of traditional fantasy storytelling, which also will be something
It's
important.
gonna be in there, yeah.
Exactly. But we'll go one step further and we'll account for the rise of modern fantasy storytelling, in particular the grimdark subgenres. And without further ado, I'll give you the word.
Great, thank you. So, as Danny said, my name is Father Philip-Neri Reese. As you can tell, I don't need a microphone. So the Dominican order is the order of preachers, and so I can project. I do want to begin this talk with an apology. The first time that I was blessed to be able to come here to Barcelona to give a talk for the chapters here, I had a fully prepared text. I was able to give it a month ahead of time, and students here were able to translate it so that everyone in the audience had a Spanish translation of my talk. I have not done that this time, so I apologize. I will try to speak slower than I normally do, and I will speak just as loudly as I normally do. So, as Danny said, this talk is actually many years now in the making, because when I first met Danny at one of our summer seminars in Rome, he was already at the end of that seminar trying to get me to give a talk on why George R.R. Martin is bad. This is the closest that I will ever come to giving that talk, right? This is not that talk. This is hopefully more than that, and hopefully a little bit more principled than that. But you'll see that I have conceded a lot of ground to Danny. So this talk is called Truth, Goodness, and Fantasy Literature. And the subtitle is really sort of what's going on here. I want to offer you Thomistic reflections on the rise of a particular subgenre within the bigger genre of fantasy literature. The plan for the talk is very simple. I want to do 3 things. I want to start by reflecting on recent trends in the genre of fiction literature called fantasy. Then I want to take a big step backwards and do some general abstract theorizing from a Thomistic perspective. And in particular, what I want to look at is Aquinas' account of truth and goodness. And then we're going to zoom back in. And what I want to do is suggest that we can apply what St. Thomas says about truth and goodness, and particularly truth and goodness with respect to art, to the genre of fantasy literature. And so the particular core question that I'm going to pose at the end of section 1, we are then going to answer in section 3, using everything from section 2. So it's all tight and systematic, the way that St. Thomas would want it. So part 1, reflections on recent fantasy literature. So the fantasy genre has come quite a long way since Tolkien. And one of the ways that we can see how far fantasy has come and how much fantasy has developed is by looking at all of the different subgenres within fantasy literature. So here's one account of just a small smattering of subgenres. People distinguish between magical realism versus heroic fantasy versus dark fantasy versus fairy tale versus urban fantasy and historical fantasy and mythic fantasy. Here's a different set of subgenres. There's a little bit of overlap. You have urban fantasy, that one overlaps, but steampunk, lit RPG, high fantasy, weird fantasy, occult detective fantasy, right? You're seeing that, we're getting pretty deep in the weeds here, right? So the amount of fantasy literature that is being written now is just magnitudes more than when Tolkien and Lewis and the Inklings were kind of beginning fantasy, drawing on a few earlier key sources back in Oxford. So here are just a couple different ways that you can divide fantasy into genres. You can divide fantasy by the role that magic plays in the plot and in the character development. And so typically people will call something high fantasy if magic is playing an important role in the development of the characters, in the movement of the plot, in key elements in the story. On the other hand, there's low fantasy, where what the author is doing is sort of adding a single thread or a single element of fantasy into the story, but it kind of sits in the background. It doesn't play a pivotal, crucial role in the development of any of the characters or in the movement of the plot. But you can also generate subgenres of fantasy just based on setting. So here are 3 genres of fantasy based on local settings, so setting in place. You have otherworldly fantasies, where the entire plot from beginning to end takes place in a fictional, fantastical world. You have what are called portal fantasies, where one of the main characters moves or transitions, right, goes through a portal from the real world to the fantasy world. So you can think of Alice in Wonderland or the Chronicles of Narnia are portal fantasies. There are also urban fantasies, right? Just fantasy stories that mainly take place in a city. And then there are setting-based subgenres that are focused on time. So you have historical fantasies that take place in an alternate version of the past. And you have contemporary fantasies that take place in an alternate version of the present. Lastly, and this isn't exhaustive, I'm just trying to give you a sense of how many fantasy subgenres there are. We can divide fantasy based on the characters, the key characters involved. So one of the oldest forms of this is the Bildungsroman, the coming of age fantasy, where the main character starts as a child or as an adolescent, and then you sort of watch the main character grow up into a mature adult. But then there are also fantasies that have as their central character an anti-hero, right? So someone who has either one or many really deep-seated character flaws, right? And so the main character is not your typical, the hero who kind of glows gold, right? It's a deeply wounded character who's placed at the center. Now, these subgenres can and almost always do overlap. So just to give you some examples, you can have a high anti-heroic portal fantasy. So Stephen R. Donaldson's very, very famous Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever is a really good example of this. So it's high fantasy in the sense that, you know, it's like Tolkien, you know, there are elves and dwarves and magic everywhere. It's a portal fantasy like Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, in the sense that the main character transitions from our world to the fantasy world. And it's an anti-heroic fantasy. So in this particular one, the main character in the real world has leprosy. And that really psychologically scars him. And when he moves into the fantasy world, he's healed of his leprosy. And so he can, all of a sudden, he can feel. And he doesn't have to check his body for whether he's injured or bleeding in ways that he did in the real world. But precisely because that's dangerous for a leper, he's threatened by believing that this fantasy world is real, right? Because if he gives into this belief, right, it could potentially lead him to engage in life-threatening behavior, like not thinking that he has leprosy, right? And so as a result of the psychological trauma of moving into this fantasy world, the main character, especially in the first book, does a lot of really bad things, right? So he's not your typical hero, right? Here's another intersection of subgenres. You can have high urban historical fantasy. So this is actually one of my favorite recent fantasy books. It's a genuine marvel to read, and for anyone who's a bibliophile, a lover of books, and kind of a nerd like that, this will scratch every one of your itches. The footnotes, yes, it has footnotes, are hilarious and wonderful. But so Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is a re-envisioning of Napoleonic era England, just with one little tweak. There has always been magic. And so England has a history of magic that has faded away. And the book is about the renewal of English magic in the time of the Napoleonic Wars. It's a party, it's a lot of fun. You can have low contemporary coming of age fantasy. Laura Esquivel's Like Water for Chocolates, this is sometimes also referred to as magical realism fantasy, is low contemporary coming of age. So the magical elements don't play any kind of important pivotal role in the development of the characters or the movement of the plot, but they sort of they color the way that we get an insight into the main character's mind. And I could go on and on. But of all the various subgenres that have arisen in recent years in fantasy literature, there's one particular subgenre that I want to focus our attention on. And I'm calling this a troubling subgenre. It's usually referred to as grimdark fantasy. So historically, the word grimdark, I was talking with Danny about this before the talk, the word grimdark comes not from anything literary, but from a board game, that a kind of science fiction board game that has as its the opening line on the box was something like, in a grim, dark future, etc., etc. But from a literary perspective, this genre of fantasy begins really in 1984 with the publication of Glenn Cook's The Black Company. The most famous example of grimdark, however, and the one with which I'm sure all of you will be familiar in some form, came a decade later with the publication in 1996 of George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones. So Martin has not yet finished his series. He will almost certainly die before he does, but it was turned into, you know, a very famous HBO series, right? And that really, the rise of the Game of Thrones really encouraged a lot more people to begin writing and reading in this grimdark genre. Just a few other examples. So that's the first really hideous cover art of the very first publication of the book. In 2006, Joe Abercrombie wrote The Blade Itself, which kind of reinvigorated the genre. In 2008, just 2 years later, Richard Morgan published The Steel Remains. And then in 2011, Mark Lawrence published A Prince of Thorns. So these are, I mean, those came in rapid succession. Each one of those was the beginning of a series of grimdark novels that kind of overlap. And these three I picked just because they're the most famous. So they're not even the only ones. More recently, we have Rob J. Hayes's Along the Razor's Edge, which is also the beginning of a series that's ongoing. So, and the number of grimdark novels that have been written is prolific, right? So it is one of the most popular subgenres of fantasy literature today. But what actually is it? That's harder to nail down, right? There's, and I'm not going to give you a single definition of grimdark, because any single definition that I give you, there will be someone who will object to it. What I think will be more helpful is to give you a series of definitions or descriptions of the subgenre that have been offered by fantasy authors themselves. So one of the most famous contemporary authors of fantasy is N.K. Jemisin, and she describes grimdark as being about dark, broken worlds with dark, broken characters. Dark, broken worlds with dark, broken characters. That, I've arranged these descriptions in order from most inclusive to most sort of strict. So this one, so Jemison's description is very broad, right? It might also include something like dark fantasy, but a lot of people want to distinguish between grim-dark fantasy and just dark fantasy. So here's something that's a little bit closer to grimdark. Adam Roberts describes grimdark fantasies as fantasies that turn their backs on the more uplifting pre-Raphaelite vision of idealized Medievalia, and instead stress how nasty and brutish and short and dark life back then, and these are scare quotes, really was. So Roberts thinks that, in fact, thinks that grimdark fantasy authors go too far, right, and are actually depicting something unrealistically dark and unrealistically depressing. But that's the way he characterizes it. Michael J. Sullivan describes grimdark fantasy like this. He says they are novels where all of the characters seem mired in a morass of hopelessness. Their lives are weighed down by misery. There is no possibility of joy, no reason to aspire to anything, because in the end, there is no chance of a better life or a greater good. Okay, that's dark, right? And that's definitely what people think of when they think of Game of Thrones, right? You know, so the heroic characters get murdered by totally wicked characters. There's absolutely no sense as you go through these kinds of novels that that hope is on the horizon. And yeah, Sullivan's description of grimdark is not even the strongest. So here's what Liz Bork says. She says it's a subgenre that values its gritty realism and that attempts to overturn long-established heroic tropes. Its defining characteristic, she thinks, lies in a retreat into the valorization of darkness for darkness's sake, into a kind of nihilism that portrays right action, by which we mean personal morality, as either impossible or futile. So my hope is that these four descriptions or definitions of grimdark are giving you a good sense of what this subgenre of fantasy is like, and in a very real way, what it's about, right? So it's clear that the authors of these kinds of fantasies they're rejecting the earlier forms of fantasies that are more hopeful, right? A little bit lighter, brighter, to use Adams or Roberts's definition, right? Pre-Raphaelite fantasies. And instead, what they want to say is, no, that's not the way things are, and that's not the way things could be, right? And that's certainly not the way that things are in my fantasy world, right? They're explicitly rejecting what came before, and they're turning to something much darker and much more hopeless. So here's my core question. Is grimdark fantasy less true, less good than other fantasy genres? And in particular, than classic fantasy, like Tolkien or Lewis? That's the core question. But I'm a philosopher, right? And so I like to break things down and analyze. So this really, I think, can be analyzed into two sub-questions. The question of, is grimdark less true than other fantasy genres? And the question, is it less good than other fantasy genres? And my gut answer is yes, right? That, like Danny, that's what I want the answer to be. However, my gut answer is not always my reasoned philosophical Thomistic answer. And so my job, both as a Dominican and as a philosophy professor, is to give you the reasoned philosophical Thomistic answer and not just how I feel about grimdark fantasy. So, in order to give you a principled, reasoned, Thomistic answer to these two questions, we need to take a step back and look at St. Thomas's account of truth and goodness. So here are two definitions that he gives, one of truth and one of goodness. So Aquinas very commonly refers to truth as the correspondence between thing and intellect. The correspondence between thing and intellect. Likewise, he says that we can identify goodness as what satisfies desire. And so the more common definition, so to speak, of goodness that Aquinas gives is just Aristotle's definition from the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics. The good is that which all things desire. But in this passage that I've cited for you, he actually goes further, and he says that the ratio, the notion, the concept of the good can be specified as what satisfies desire. And I actually think that's a more helpful definition. Now, at this point, almost all Thomists will immediately go to the transcendentals. So if for those who are not especially well versed in Aquinas's metaphysical theory, Aquinas has this very important teaching that he thinks there are certain features that are coextensive or convertible or interchangeable with being itself. So he thinks wherever you find being, you find unity. And wherever you have unity, you have being. Wherever you find being, you have truth. And wherever you find truth, you find being. Wherever you find goodness, you find being. And wherever you find being, you find goodness. So the two are all of them are interchangeable. That's the transcendental notion of the true and the good. So it's the sense in which everything corresponds to the intellect just insofar as it's being, and everything satisfies desire just insofar as it is a being. But understood in this transcendental sense, the answer to our core question is both obvious and trivial, right? No, grimdark fantasy is not less true or less good if the sense of true and good is the transcendental sense. Why? Because grimdark fantasy exists just as much as any other fantasy exists, right? And according to St. Thomas, everything that exists is in some sense true and in some sense good. There is some sense in which grimdark fantasy, just by being, can correspond to the mind. And there's some sense in which grimdark fantasy, just by being, can satisfy desire, right? There are lots of people out there who like grimdark fantasy. And all of us, potentially, are those people, right? But there's this further question of, do we have to be messed up to be those people, right? Does something have to go wrong in our appetitive desires for us to be transformed into lovers of the subgenre, right? But notice, that is requiring us to move away from the sense of truth and the sense of goodness that are transcendental in Aquinas' theory. And that's exactly something that we can and should do. Because St. Thomas recognizes more than just the transcendental sense of truth, and more than just the transcendental sense of goodness. And I want to suggest to you that those non-transcendental senses of truth and non-transcendental senses of goodness are actually the more important ones for us. And they're definitely more important for answering our core questions. So here's a big quote. We will unpack it. In the De Veritate, St. Thomas says that the completion of any motion or operation is its endpoint. But the motion of a cognitive power, a knowing power, terminates in the soul, for it's necessary that the knowledge be in the knower in a way appropriate to the knower. Whereas the motion of a desiring power, an appetitive power, terminates in the thing desired. And this is why Aristotle posits a sort of circularity in the soul's actions. For the thing outside the soul moves the intellect. The thing as understood in the intellect moves the desire, the appetite, and the appetite reaches out so as to attain the thing from which the motion began, the thing that you first understood and saw and now desire. So there's this circle motion. Now, since good expresses the order of a being to the appetite, whereas true expresses its order to the mind, to the intellect, this explains why Aristotle says that good and bad are mainly in things, while truth and falsity are mainly in the mind. A thing, however, is not called true unless it corresponds to an intellect. And so truth, he says, is found primarily in the intellect and secondarily in the thing. So I made two charts to kind of unpack what's going on here. So the top shows us what Aquinas is saying with respect to truth, and the bottom with respect to goodness. So in the case of truth, the relationship is between thing and mind is a relationship of information, right? The thing comes to inform the mind, right? So the thing that you know enters into your mind, so to speak, and informs your mind. So, and that's even why we use the word, at least in English, information, right? Is you learn by being informed by the thing that you're studying. And in this case, of an information relation, what's primarily true, what's mainly true, the principal sense of truth is the mind that is informed by the thing. And what's secondarily true is the thing that informs the mind. It flips around when we turn to goodness. So the appetites, our desires, aren't relations of information, they're relations of ecstasy, right? They are ecstatic relations. They reach out to the thing, they push us beyond ourselves, right? So the will reaches out to the thing desired. And in this ecstatic relationship, what's primarily good is the thing, the object of the will, and not the will that's desired, right? So the thing desired is what's good in the most important sense of goodness. And the will that desires can be called good in a secondary sense, but not in the most important sense. Okay. Now we're going to, I want to focus in on nuancing even further the primary sense of the good. So one of the things that St. Thomas often does when he talks about goodness is he thinks it's really important to distinguish the way that creatures are good from the way that God is good. And in particular, he says that God is good by essence, whereas creatures are good only by participation, right? So one way to think of that is creatures come to be good, whereas God just is his goodness. In one of the passages where he explains that distinction, St. Thomas says this: God alone is good by essence. For each thing is called good insofar as it is perfect. But the perfection of a thing is threefold. First, insofar as it is constituted simply in its being, right? Just insofar as it exists. Second, a creature is good to the extent that its accidents, its characteristics or features, that are necessary for its perfect operation are added to it, right? So when something has all of the features and characteristics that it needs to have in order to engage in the kind of activity that's uniquely its own, that makes it good in a second sense, in a further sense. Third, a creature can be called good on account of the fact that it attains some other thing as its end or its goal, its telos in Greek. For example, the first perfection of fire just consists in its being, right? That there is fire, which it has through its substantial form. So the substantial form of fire informs matter, and then is the principle of the existence of fire. Its second perfection consists in the fires being hot, being light, being dry, and other things that are characteristic of fire, and that enable it to do the kinds of things that fire does naturally. Its third perfection is its coming to rest in its proper place, right? So in St. Thomas's vision of the cosmos that he kind of gets from Aristotle, all of the natural elements have a proper place in the universe, right? So fire goes up, rocks go down, right? And so when fire is free to go up the way that it kind of naturally desires to move, and it kind of finds its proper place in the cosmos, then it has achieved its end or its goal, right? For me, my proper place is the dinner table, right? So when I get to the dinner table and I'm seated at the dinner table, right, I rest and all of my desires are satisfied, right? But so each thing has its own proper place. Now, this threefold perfection does not pertain to any creature by essence, but rather only to God, of whom alone his essence and his existence, his essence is his existence, and to whom no accidents are added on top, etc. And nor is God ordered to anything else as to an end, right? So these three distinct goodnesses are characteristic of created goodness, not divine goodness. It's kind of like, you can think of divine simplicity as a black hole, right? Everything that's in God, because of divine simplicity, just is God. That's not true for creatures. So for us, we have these three distinct perfections or goodnesses. And all of those have to do with what in the previous quote, Aquinas called the primary sense of goodness. So I made you more charts, right? So we're just thinking about the primary sense of goodness, the goodness of the thing, right? Not the goodness of the will that's desiring the thing, right? So the goodness of the thing initially is just its being, its existence. Subsequently, it's the proper accidents of the thing. I couldn't get accidents to fit in without breaking up the word, and it was annoying. My desire for perfection and my OCD requires that all of the circles be exactly the same size. So I couldn't make the circle bigger so that it would say accidents altogether. Ultimately, however, the primary goodness of the thing is its ability to attain its final end. So notice we have three graded senses of goodness, even in this primary sense, according to St. Thomas, right? So the most important sense in which something can be called good for St. Thomas is when it achieves its final end, its ultimate goal. That is radically not the transcendental sense of goodness, right? Every flower wilts, right? Every human being, short of our Lord, dies, right? Even our Lord died, right? Now he lives never to die again, right? But there are lots and lots and lots of natural things that fail to achieve their final end, or that achieve their final end, right? And I mean, here's the horror of mortal sin, right? To speak in the supernatural realm, right? You can achieve your final end, right? You can be united and partaking in the divine nature through the gift of sanctifying grace, and then you can lose it through mortal sin, right? So there are lots of things that never become good in this sense of goodness. I used the laser. Yeah, great. So this is not transcendental goodness, but it's the most important sense of goodness, according to St. Thomas. Now, if you thought, okay, he's a Thomist, of course he's going to make distinctions, but like, as they say in Italy, basta così, right? Enough. No, not enough. Because we've only drawn distinctions for goodness. Now it's time to turn our attention to truth. St. Thomas says, again in the De Veritate, we must understand that a thing is related to the practical intellect in a different way than it is related to the speculative intellect. For the practical intellect causes the thing, and so is the measure of the things that it brings about. But the speculative intellect, because it receives something from things, that's that information relation, is in some way moved by those things. And so the things are the measure of it, the speculative intellect. And from this, it's clear that the natural things from which our intellect acquires knowledge measure our minds. So again, charts, right? You can see I'm a visual learner. So we can distinguish between speculative intellect and practical intellect. In the case of speculative intellect, the natural thing out there, right? So here's a truth of the natural world. Cats are evil, right? That's just a truth of the natural world, right? No cat is morally good, right? All of them are wicked, right? Here's another truth of the natural world, right? The degree to which you own, as the number of cats that you own increases, the likelihood of your getting married decreases in exact proportion, right? So more cats, less marriage, right? Which is just another proof that cats are evil, right? Because marriage is good, marriage is blessed by God, cats inhibit marriage, right? Now, these are truths of the natural world, right? And so if we want to know about cats, they need to be the measure of our mind and our understanding, right? So why is it true to say that cats do not bark and cats do meow? At least those are the words in English. I recently learned that that animals make very different noises depending on what country they're from. So apparently, yeah, I can't quite remember it, and I'm not going to try, but Korean dogs make very strange sounds. But in American cats say meow. American dogs say woof or bark. So cats don't bark. That's true. The measure of that truth, the thing that determines that that is true, is the cat out there in the world, right? That never barks and always meows. So our mind needs to submit to the external world, right? Our mind needs to be measured by the external world in order for us to speculatively know cats. But that's not the way it goes for practical intellect. So in the case of practical intellection, the mind causes the artificial thing that you make, right? So suppose you're deeply morally flawed, you're one of these high portal anti-heroic fantasy main characters, and your deep character flaw is that you love cats, right? And so suppose your twisted love of cats kind of is the catalyst for you to take up, I have no idea what the Spanish word for this is, whittling. It's when you take a knife and you carve wood. So suppose you are whittling out of wood over and over again little cat statues, right? Now in that case, you decide what form you want the cat statue to take, right? Do you want to whittle a fat cat like Garfield? Do you want to whittle, a thin, starving cat, right? Do you want to, whittle a cat with stripes? Your mind decides that, right? And then your practical intellect moves you to create the thing. In that case, right, the thing that results from your practical action is measured by your mind, right? What you produced either measures up to what you were thinking about, or it fails to measure up to what you were thinking. In this case, just keep that in mind, and we're going to add some nuance, right? So, St. Thomas goes on to say, natural things are themselves measured by the divine intellect, in which all things are like artifacts, right? So the relationship between you and your twisted cat sculpture, right, is like the relationship between God and the natural world, right? It is God's work of art in a literal and precise sense of the word art. In this way, therefore, the divine intellect is a measure, but is not itself measured by anything. in any way, right? The only way that the divine intellect relates to the natural world is practically, right? God doesn't speculate about the natural world the way that we do, he makes it. The natural thing is, in a sense, a measure, and in another sense, measured. Our intellect is measured by and not a measure of natural things. It's only a measure for artificial objects. Standing therefore between two intellects, the natural thing can be called true insofar as it corresponds between either. For insofar as it corresponds with the divine intellect, it is called true to the extent that it measures up to the divine mind. But insofar as it corresponds to a human intellect, the natural thing is called true to the extent that it is apt to cause a true thought about itself. And it's false to the extent that it fails to do that, right? So at least in English, we talk about false gold or fool's gold, which is not gold, but it looks like it, right? And so we call it false gold precisely because it's the sort of thing that is likely to make us think that it's gold, but it ain't. So, more charts. We've got a kind of a cascading asymmetric move from all the way up from the divine mind, all the way down to artificial things. So, the divine practical intellect causes the things in the natural world. And from the perspective of this practical relationship of mind and thing, the natural thing in the world that is made by God's active practical thought is what's primarily true. Whereas the divine mind is only only true in a secondary sense, right? We only in a very loose sense is God's thought made true by the things in the world. That's how our minds work, right? So in the case of human speculative intellection, when we're thinking about cats as opposed to God, right? It's a deep mystery why God created cats, but he did, right? And insofar as God practically thinks about making cats, right? The cat is primarily what's true, and God's mind is secondarily what's true. When we then think about the cats that God has made, speculatively, the natural thing is now the measure of our minds, and it's our minds thinking about those things that's primarily true, and the natural thing is only secondarily true. But we can flip it one more time. In human practical thought, our minds, like God's mind with respect to nature, causes the artificial thing, the work of art. And in this case, the artificial thing is what's primarily true, and our minds are only secondarily true. Okay, so just know where we've ended here, right? There is a sense of truth that is a primary sense of truth when we're talking about artificial things, right? Artificial things, right, works of art, are true in the primary sense of truth to the extent that they measure up to the mind of their maker, right? So when you're intending to whittle a fat wooden cat, and instead you make, you slip and you cut off its big tummy, right? And so you make now, don't pout. This is a happy story, right? You're helping to rid the world of fat cats, right? What you've produced is not the true work of art that was intended in that moment, right? It has failed to live up to, failed to measure up to your mind as an artist, right? And so you can say that that's not the true cat that I was trying to make. Okay. Now, We're finally done all the nuance, all the distinction. Now we can apply theory to fantasy. So remember our core question. Is grimdark fantasy less true, less good than other fantasy subgenres? And in particular, is it less true, less good than classic fantasy like Tolkien? And our two sub-questions, is it less true? Is it less good? And we've already said we're not going to think about transcendental truth, transcendental goodness, right? If that's all we're doing, then the answer is obvious and trivial, right? It's just not interesting. So what about in the more interesting sense, in the non-trivial sense, in the more important sense of truth and goodness? Well, now we can actually give a principled Thomistic answer to both of those sub-questions. Is grimdark fantasy less true than other fantasy subgenres? No. At least not essentially or necessarily. And here's why. I'm going to give it to you. I'm a philosopher, right? So I'm going to give it to you in a syllogistic argument. So all art is true just to the extent that it measures up to what its maker had in mind. Right? We just saw that, right? As the primary, most important sense in which an artifact can be called true. Grimdark literature is art. So, grimdark fantasy literature is true to the extent that it measures up to what its maker, i.e. its author, has in mind. But guess what? There is literally nothing about grimdark fantasy that requires that it measure up to the mind of its maker less than high portal fantasy, like the Chronicles of Narnia, right? Therefore, there's nothing about grimdark fantasy that requires it to be less true than other fantasy subgenres, right? So, look, it's just as possible that when C.S. Lewis wrote the first edition of, the Chronicles of Narnia, he was dissatisfied with, he wrote Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe first, right? So imagine Lewis reflecting on the first edition of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? Now imagine George R. R. Martin reflecting on the first edition of Game of Thrones. It's just as possible and just as plausible and just as likely that Lewis would be dissatisfied with the first edition of the book that he wrote as Martin, right? Which means it's just as possible for Lewis to say, it doesn't quite capture what I want it to capture, right? It's not quite measuring up, right? It's not quite the true story that I wanted to tell. Lewis could say that, right? Probably did say that, right? Just like Martin could say that. And there's nothing about grimdark as a, unless you think that people like Lewis and Tolkien, which is not a crazy position, right? Are like Dante, inspired by the Holy Spirit, right? And so in that case, right, it would necessarily measure, right? But setting aside, post-scriptural works of divine inspiration, right? It's totally plausible that an author will say that this just doesn't quite measure up. Just as a side note, right? I think one of the things that this means is that it's possible for second editions or third editions or fourth editions of a book to be truer works of art on a Thomistic theory than the first edition. It's also possible for later editions to be falser. So there was a kind of infamous Catholic philosopher at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries who wrote a book called Action, and it got condemned by a lot of people and the church. And so in the second edition, he basically just took out all of the parts that got condemned. And almost everyone thinks that almost everyone who works with his thought works with the first edition. Because they think the first edition is what actually captured his thought, expressed his mind better, right? So in that sense, the later editions are falser than the earlier editions. But there's nothing about grimdark fantasy that requires that. Okay. Is it less good than other fantasy subgenres? Here the answer I think is yes, essentially and necessarily. Why? So all art, so first, one way to try to answer this would be to try to sort of like focus in on what the proper end or telos or purpose of fantasy literature as such is. I am totally not gonna do that, because that's way too hard, right? And if you don't need to do something that's way too hard and way too controversial, don't. So my argument does not require any particular theory about the purpose of fantasy literature as fantasy literature. Which is a strength of the argument, because it means if you're coming here preloaded with your own preferred theory of fantasy, cool, I can accommodate. You can debate amongst yourselves what the proper telos of fantasy literature is, and I can accommodate all of them. So my tent is big enough for all of them. So here's the core argument. All art is good to the extent that it is rightly ordered to God as its final end, right? So we can debate as much as you want what the proximate or closest or proper end of fantasy literature is. I'm not taking a stand on that, right? All I'm saying is that it's got God as its final end, its ultimate end, its remote and even its remotest end. But grimdark fantasy literature cannot be rightly ordered to God as its final and remote and ultimate end. Therefore, grimdark fantasy literature cannot be good in that fullest and ultimate sense of goodness, right? So remember, primary sense of good as good, the goodness of the thing, that then has 3 iterations, right? So there's the goodness of it just insofar as it is, there's the goodness of it insofar as it has all the kind of proper characteristics and features that it needs, and then there's the goodness that it has insofar as it attains its end, right? So the claim here is that grimdark fantasy always necessarily and essentially fails on that last point. It cannot, in principle, attain its final end. So grimdark fantasy literature cannot be good in the fullest and ultimate sense. The trick, then, is why should we think that the premises of that argument are true? Right? Why should we think that all art is good to the extent that it's rightly ordered to God as its final end? And why should we think that grimdark fantasy literature cannot be rightly ordered to God as its final end? Well, I'm a philosopher, so I have proofs. So here are 3 proofs of premise 1. First proof, I call it the natural argument. Nature is essentially ordered to God as its final end. Art imitates nature. Therefore, art is essentially ordered to God as its final end. If you want in the Q&A to talk about any of those premises, I'm perfectly happy to talk about those premises. Write down your furious objections, and we can go there. But I'm taking the sawed-off shotgun approach here. I'm being St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Contra Gentiles, where he just gives you a whole bunch of arguments, and all I need is for one of these to stick. So if you find the nature argument unconvincing, how about the human argument, right? Human actions are essentially ordered to God as their final end. But artistry is a kind of human action, right? The production of art is a kind of human action. Therefore, artistry, the production of art, right, and so the art produced, is essentially ordered to God as its final end, right? And again, final here is important. There are final ends, and then there are more proximate and proper and closer ends, right? So I'm not making any claims about what the proximate and proper and closer end of art is, or of fantasy literature in particular. But suppose you don't like either of those arguments. Here's an argument that's almost offensively simple, that I think is also probably the hardest one to object to. I call it the universal argument. Everything is essentially ordered to God as its final end. Art is a thing. Therefore, art is essentially ordered to God as its final end, right? Like, deny one of those two premises, right? Okay, so these are three arguments in order to prove our major premise from the earlier one. So I take it that I'm just going to go forward and say I've established the major. So now I need to prove the minor. Here are two proofs. First, an argument from Sullivan's description or definition of grimdark. Anything that presents as true the idea that there is, quote, no possibility for joy and no reason to aspire to anything, because in the end there is no chance of a better life or a greater good, cannot be rightly ordered to God as its final end, right? Those two things are incompatible, right? That sort of dismal vision of the world and cannot be ordered to God as its final end. But guess what? Grimdark literature presents as true precisely that idea. The idea that there is no possibility for joy and no reason to aspire to anything, because in the end, there is no chance of a better life and a greater good. Therefore, by force of logic, grimdark fantasy literature cannot be rightly ordered to God as its final end. Now, an argument from Bork's description, right? But it takes the same form. Anything, the defining characteristic of which is the retreat into the valorization of darkness for darkness's sake, into a kind of nihilism that portrays right action in terms of personal morality as either impossible or futile, simply cannot be rightly ordered to God as its final end. Those two things are incompatible. But grimdark fantasy has that as its defining characteristic. At least that's the way Bork sees it. Therefore, grimdark fantasy literature cannot be rightly ordered to God as its final end. So note what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that grimdark fantasy literature isn't good in the transcendental sense of goodness according to which it exists, right? It does. I'm also not saying that grimdark fantasy literature it is not or cannot be good in the second primary sense of goodness, right? It can have a whole lot of the proper accidents and characteristic features of, that make literature in general and fantasy literature in general good, right? It can have like a clever magic system. It can have great prose, it can have like an entertaining plot, right? It can have like brilliant twists, right? All of that secondary sense of goodness, no argument here. What it can't have is the third and most important sense of goodness. It can't reach its final ultimate end. It can't achieve what ultimately it exists to do. So yes, in that precise sense, Tolkien is better. Thanks.
For the record, I know Father is a little bit apprehensive in acknowledging the real nature of the stuff, but we just witnessed a Dominican friar give the ultimate literature storytelling Super Bowl, which one is better, dark fantasy versus Tolkien.
I live to serve, yeah.
We're gonna start the Q&A now though, so if anyone has a question.
questions, objections, crippling counterexamples?
Okay, I'll do it. So, I'm not gonna leave you off the hook.
Okay, sir. Great.
So, we've explained the theory,
Mhm.
but how about we account for the rise of, like, what's the reason for something as Machiavellic as, for example, Game of Thrones to thrive in modern society? Or even something as nihilistic and Nietzschean as Warhammer 40K, for example. What would you say are the anthropological reasons?
Okay, yeah, so that's a good question. It's also I think an unfair question because it's a question that's inevitably going to have many correct answers. So I'll just give a few that come to mind. So here's one reason, right? So we especially when it comes to art, we and novels, right? We tend to get bored with repetition. And so I take it that that's just a kind of empirical fact, right? So repetition often, not always, but often we find boring. And so there's always going to be something initially attractive about novelty, right? When Glenn Cook wrote The Black Company, and then I mean it took a decade for Martin to write Game of Thrones, but similarly, right? When they started to write that kind of fantasy literature, it was absolutely radically unlike anything that fans of fantasy had ever read before, right? And so because it was explicitly, and both Adam Roberts and Liz Bork mentioned this in the quotes that I had. It's explicitly overturning older, more typical tropes, like normal things that happen in the fantasy story, right? So instead of having the young farm boy who's actually the chosen one, who gets, whose village gets attacked, and and he finds the mystical sword or the mystical ring or the mystical hat or whatever, right? And then he gets raised up in order to to fight the whoever, right? It's like you read their stories, and like you get to chapter 20, and the farm boy gets killed. And you're like, what? This is not how this is supposed to go, right? And so novelty, right? Just something new, something different, something unexpected, that can be attractive on what I call the second primary sense of the goodness of kind of fiction and art, right? It's doing something different, it's doing something clever, right? And we do like that. Okay, that's my friendly comment. Here's my less friendly comment, right? You could be someone who's just like morally and emotionally messed up, right? You could be malformed, right? As a person, as a human being, right? And you could take, so in Latin, it's well the English translation of Latin is morose delectation, right? So you could just be the kind of person who takes delight in seeing bad things, right? And guess what? There are a whole lot more bad things to see in Cook and Martin and like all of the rest of them than in your classical fantasy, right? And even more than, so like I mentioned, the anti-heroic fantasy like Donaldson, even in something in your standard anti-heroic fantasies, you usually watch the anti-hero go through a moral transformation. right? They start bad or flawed or, wounded in some way, and then you see them go through a process of growth or healing or transformation, right? But in grimdark fantasy, that never happens, right? So if you're the kind of person who takes delight in seeing someone who's morally bad or deeply flawed never get better, guess what? You're gonna really like grimdark fantasy, right? And the reality is, like, we have a lot of people in the world who are like that, and so, so I think I've just given two answers, right? So one is being excited and interested in just novelty and seeing something different and seeing something that bucks the trends. But then another one could just be that there are a lot of people who actually take delight in the darkness of it, right? That's certainly the way that Liz Borg thinks it's going.
Anyone else? I can translate by the way.
Like in one of the arguments, you put one of the premises to be that art imitates nature.
Yes.
Okay, can you make like a Thomistic account of why it's
Art.
correct? Yeah, of
Yeah.
why art imitates nature? Because if it will, for example, for abstract art, we could say like medieval Romanesque symbolic art.
Sure. Yeah, great question. And that is, that, like, if I was going to object to premises here, the art imitates nature. I mean, I actually think the nature argument works. I definitely think it's the weakest of these three, and weakest in the proper kind of technical philosophical sense, that you're going to need to provide many demonstrations in order to get to those first two premises. But answer, yes, I can do better than give a Thomistic explanation. I can give Thomas's demonstration. So Aquinas gives a demonstration for to prove that art imitates nature, and it goes like this. Art never expresses anything that is that's not formulated by the artist in kind of the interior senses, right? So remember, like, the artist has to come up with the idea of what he or she is going to make, right? But what are the materials, so to speak, the inner materials that the artist uses in order to come up with the idea of the piece of art? Well, it's everything, all of the deliverances of our senses, right? So it's, what the artist's palette, so to speak, is anything and everything that he or she has ever seen, has ever heard, has ever touched, has ever tasted, has ever smelled, right? That's what the artist has to work with when he or she comes up with the idea. But guess what? Everything that we have from our senses comes from nature. Right? So guess what no human artist can do in principle? No human artist can in principle ever make a painting using colors that are not on the color spectrum, that are not on the visible spectrum, right? We can't paint with ultraviolet colors. We have to translate ultraviolet rays into things that we can see, and then imitate the things that the color that we see, right? But so if you can't touch it, you can't taste it, you can't see it, you can't smell it, and you can't hear it, then you can't make it into a piece of art. So all art has to come from the senses, and the senses just deliver what nature already had to give us. So in fact, everything that we produce by art is really just a reflection of what nature gives us through the senses. And that's the sense in which art imitates nature. What's the
This question is a bit of a devil's advocate, but
Yes, please.
so we could say that grimdark fantasy, although it's not as good as in traditional fantasy, it reflects human experience. And in that sense, if it fits with the author's intention, I think it could be good in some way, because, for example, some dark fantasy stories highlight, for example, the fact that some stories end badly, or that human people are not black and white, but gray. And I think I don't know, it's a question, but traditional fantasy sometimes may not reflect these aspects.
I mean, you also have that maybe precisely that grim and dark world precisely reflects our fallen state and our fallen world.
Yeah, good. So I think both of these, well, this one objection together is a really good objection. And I have two thoughts in response. So one, which is kind of the cheap response, the cop-out response, is this. Well, I already made a distinction earlier between dark fantasy and grimdark fantasy, right? And so my claim is not that dark fantasy can't be rightly ordered to God as its final end. My claim is only that grimdark fantasy can't. And what's the difference between the two? Just this, that dark fantasy doesn't sort of intend to communicate the sense of hopelessness or futility of like the moral project or something like that. It just intends to express like that life has tragedies, right? And so I mean, one example that I didn't give of a dark fantasy is oh shoot. It's not Sword of Truth, that's wait, no, maybe it is Sword of Truth. It's not Terry Brooks, but I'm gonna call it Sword of Truth. But you know, so there are lots of high fantasies that are dark fantasies where, you know, it's lots of bad things, like there's lots of tragedy, right? You know, and there are a lot more character deaths in it, right? There are a lot more villages that don't get protected by knights in shining armor, right? And yet, nevertheless, it's clear that the narrative arc is not intending to communicate that like hopelessness is part of reality, right? And that grimdark does. So that's my cheap answer. My second answer, that hopefully is a little bit less cheap, is to kind of push a little bit harder. So I think you're exactly right that there are, in just the same way that it can be really important in music to have moments of dissonance, right? And moments of disharmony. It can be really important in fantasy literature to have these moments of tragedy, right? Like moments where like a character that you have fallen in love with and you know and think is really great, right? Like dies, right? And the hero doesn't get there in time to save them, and you know, and that those tragic moments, those dark moments, right? You know, the moments where you might be tempted to despair, right? Where the characters might be tempted to despair, are actually really important moments. And in just the same way that that music that is utterly without any moments of kind of disharmony or you know dissonant tension can be kind of boring, right? Same thing with fantasy literature that doesn't have moments of tragedy, right? Like if at every point of kind of narrative tension, you know, the hero appears and the day is saved, right? You kind of lose interest, right? But there's a difference between needing dissonance on the way to harmonic resolution and landing with disharmony, right? Or having the entire thing be disharmonic. So I'm just gonna show my own musical preferences here. I would be inclined to say, but I'm not making this argument here and now, that something like atonal music or 12-tonal music, that arose in the 20th century, is more like grimdark fantasy than something else, right? Like, when music attempts to at every moment overturn like what most people take to be kind of like the laws of musical aesthetics, right? Then you're communicating something more than just that you're like we live in a fallen world and there's tragedy, right? Because we live in a fallen world that will be redeemed, right? And so the question is, are you communicating that we live in a fallen world and that there's tragedy? Or are you communicating that we live in a fallen world and there's tragedy and there's no hope for I'm gonna not allow you to speak, because did you have a further question? No, you didn't.
Well, so I think you're saying that grimdark fantasy is not real art because if in the end it does not follow a real human experience.
Well, I think so. Yeah, so that's tricky. I think grimdark fantasy can be real. I mean, I think it's real art in this sense, but I also think it is real or can be good art in this sense, right? So look, like there are some, like the authors of grimdark fantasy that I gave you as examples, right? Or most, like George R. R. Martin or Glenn Cook or the guy who wrote Prince of Thorns, right? Like some of them are really good prose writers, and so that's a sense of art, right? Like being able to write good prose, right, is beautiful writing is that's a kind of artistry that they absolutely can do. So I think there's lots of stuff in here that you can have that's not related to the fact that it won't ultimately achieve this. The only other thing that I would want to add in response to your question is just a little bit of nitpicking when it comes to wording, right? So at one point in your question, it sounded like you were equating communicating what the author wants it to communicate, right? With goodness. I think from a Thomistic perspective, that's actually not the right alignment, right? That when a novel communicates exactly what the author wants it to communicate, that's not so much a good making feature of it, but a truth making feature, right? Like, so it's, so I think absolutely, right? Like these grimdark fantasies can be very high on the truth measure, right? In the sense that they can communicate exactly what the author wants to communicate. Then the question for us is what the author wants to communicate good? And my claim is that, at least in this one precise sense, for grimdark fantasy, the answer is no, right? So if one of the things that the author wants to communicate is that hopelessness, right, and the futility of trying to be a moral person is part of the real world, right? Then that thing that they want to communicate, right? They might truly communicate that with the book, but that very thing that they're truly communicating is bad, right? And so that's what prevents it from achieving that sense of goodness. Okay, now I'll loose your tongue.
So wouldn't you be also be able to make a small distinction, because I see different types of grimdark, you know, like for
Okay.
example, Warhammer 40K, it's not really giving you, it's not really prescriptive.
Okay,
It's just, you know, there's a world, there's violence in Germany, that's about it. But Game of Thrones has a clear subversive element. In the sense that it's almost a Nietzschean inversion of morality. It tries to show you, no, if you are good, you suck. If you're bad, you're great. I would say that's a very crucial line.
yeah, good. So, first I should say, I'm totally open to learning about subdivisions within the subgenre that is grimdark. So if that's the case, I'm happy to learn.
I'm taking it away.
However, I do want to push back in this sense. That, so here's, I'll give you something and then I'll take it back immediately. So I'll give you this. It sounds like what you're saying is, look, why don't we just go with what Jemison says? Right? Look, it's just like, here's all we mean by grimdark, right? It's dark broken worlds with dark broken characters. Play, right? Have fun. Enter that world, right? And it's not trying to say anything more, right? Okay, right, like if you want to take that, you know, if you want to say Jemison gets it right, and everyone, all those other three descriptions are too strong, you're perfectly within your rights to do that. I don't want to do that, and the reason why I don't want to do that is because I can't tell the difference. If all we have is Jemison's description, I can't tell the difference between grimdark fantasy and dark fantasy. And so here's my worry. I'll put it as, I'll explain it as a worry, is it seems like this is a distinction that lots of people do make, and it seems like it's a distinction that they find helpful. If I allow what you're suggesting, that, you know, that there might be a form of grimdark that only says what Jemison says, right? That is only committed to like the 4K kind of, you know, play in this dark, distorted world version. Then I don't know how to make the kind of distinction that lots of people think is helpful to make. But as soon as I make that distinction, then I think it looks like you can't just say that grimdark is just like a kind of brutal world with no message.
I like that.
Thanks. You got something for me?
Yeah, maybe. But looking at like difference between dark and grimdark, and maybe there being no good in grimdark, isn't then, as example, Tolkien, the Children of Húrin, isn't that sort of grimdark? Cool. It's like at the end, it's everybody dies, it's the parents crying, and it's
nice.
It's a grimdark end.
Yeah, no, so cool. So I would be inclined to say it's not. And here's why. I mean, anybody who came to my talk last year knows that my favorite Tolkien is the Silmarillion. And so I think that's important precisely because Children of Húrin is like one part of a much bigger story, right? And so I think in a sense, what you're doing with this really good question is it would sort of be like if we on like, you've got a piece of music on SoundCloud, right? And you just zoom in to the one little section of music that's dissonant, right? And not harmonic, right? And yeah, like if you say like, hey, I've got this really great, I found this really great song that you should listen to, hey, listen to this, and that's the only clip that you play for them, yeah, they're gonna say like, no thanks, right? But when you zoom out and you let them listen to the whole piece of music, then it contextualizes the story, right? So maybe I think my kind of principled answer would be this. If Tolkien never wrote the Silmarillion, and he never wrote anything else other than just Children of Húrin, right? And he never gave any indication that there was more to the story, right? Then, yeah, Children of Húrin probably would count as grimdark. But he didn't, right? And so, and the art is truly, it's right, we've already got the principles for measuring what makes the truth of art, right? So art is true insofar as it measures up to the mind of its maker, right? So the Children of Húrin abstracted away from the rest of the Silmarillion and presented as if it were a standalone thing with no further context is actually less truly the Children of Húrin than the Children of Húrin that appears in context, right? And so actually, so this, for me, this is really fun. You're just seeing me kind of Thomistically geek out, right? So here's what we can say. The false Children of Húrin is grimdark. The true Children of Húrin is not. And the reason is because it's only insofar as it fails to measure up to the mind of the artist, who is Tolkien, that we're in a position to say, yes, now it's grimdark. Thanks, y'all.
Hello.